Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on identifying students for gifted and advanced academic services using universal screening and local norms. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar and also introduce myself. I'm Joel McIntosh. I'm the publisher at Proofrock Press. I've been in gifted education for more than 30 years, and I'm always very proud of what we as a field are doing for kids. Let's see. First off, I hope everyone is staying safe and is healthy. We are currently in a shelter-in-place order here in Austin, Texas, because of the COVID-19 virus. Also, my co-panelist is at a shelter-in-place order up in Dallas, Texas. So you'll please forgive me if we have, from time to time, a kid shout or a dog bark. Uh, Boy, we've got a big crowd today. We've had more than 250 folks signed up. We have people from Vietnam, Peru, Turkey, Spain, Canada, and almost every state in the United States. So thanks for coming. I hope we're up to the task of meeting the expectations that you guys have on this topic. This is an important one. Three objectives for this webinar. One is to provide you a rationale for using universal screening or local norms. Another objective is to review the process that you'll go through if you do universal screening, and then walk you step by step through the process of establishing and using local norms. Before I do that, let me introduce our guest panelist or co-panelist, Dr. Leila Sanguris. She joins us from Dallas. She has a PhD in education research from the University of North Texas. She worked in Dallas ISD in the Student Analytics Department. She is currently working on a federal or a Jack Kent Cooke Foundation grant. She's developing a language arts curriculum online, a language arts curriculum for gifted learners, and that's a joint project between Northwestern University and the College of William and Mary. She teaches at Baylor University's doc program in learning and organizational change. She's written two great books for Proofrock Press. One is Raising Children with Grit. That's a parenting guide for helping develop persistence and excellence in young folks. The other is Grit in the Classroom, which is a similar topic, but for classroom teachers and how to inspire that in the classroom. She has also been a classroom teacher for more than 13 years as a middle school teacher. So welcome, Leila.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Fantastic. Let me move us quickly over to the PowerPoint presentation. That'll be our sort of guide as we go through this process. I'm going to be switching screens back and forth because I need to use both PowerPoint presentation, but then I'm going to be showing you some spreadsheets that you'll be using when you're calculating the information that we're going to be talking about. Let me switch over to the PowerPoint. So let's first talk about the kind of kids that we're going to be looking for with this process. And in March of 2019, the National Association for Gifted Children released this report, Key Considerations in Identifying and Supporting Gifted and Talented Learners. So in this publication, we get this definition, and I like this definition. Students with gifts and talents perform or have the capability to perform at higher levels compared to others of the same age, experience, and environment in one or more domains. Now, if you're using nationally normed instruments, your comparison group, and I've added those emphasis obviously, but so the comparison group, if you're using nationally normed instruments, is you're comparing your kids to a national norm, all right? But that's not necessarily appropriate. You can compare kids within the local population. That can be your comparison group. I also, before I move on into the next slide, I want to note that other phrase here. It's not just kids that are performing at the highest levels, it is kids who have the capability or the potential to perform at the highest levels. And one of the things that developing local norms allows us to do is to capture more of those kids that have the potential to perform at the highest levels. Let me talk a little bit about the rationale for using local norms or universal screening. So as I alluded to earlier, there is a question in my mind and certainly of many others. Does it make sense to compare kids in Newark, New Jersey, or Pineville, Louisiana, to all kids nationally. If we're looking for the top performers compared to a child's peers, wouldn't we be better served by looking at the local student population, especially if that local population uh, is somewhat different from the national norm? And that means that if you've got this approach, that's the second bullet, this approach is especially useful in schools that serve economically, linguistically, ethnically, or racially diverse populations, because quite often those schools don't look like the national norm. And it makes much more sense in that case to develop local norms or universal screening among your students. So this last point is it's also useful if a district coordinator is concerned about inequitable identification of students who need advanced interventions across different campuses. And for this, let me ask Layla to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so in some districts, you may have um, campuses that are different from each other demographically. So you might have, if you're thinking about using creating district norms, that may work if you have similar populations across all your campuses. But if you're concerned that maybe you're identifying 15% of your elementary students and 14% is coming from one campus, then you may want to think about bringing the local norms down to the campus level. So, for example, instead of saying that you're identifying 15% across the district, you're identifying 15% at each campus. So, what that would do is that would allow you to identify more kids, and we want to widen the net as far as kids who have potential to achieve at high levels. And it also could help you address maybe some equity issues that you're seeing in your program.
Thank you, Layla. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about referral for advanced academic services. What we don't really, what is beyond the scope of this conversation is any local or state gifted identification regulations or rules that you may have. Uh, we're really kind of going back to that that definition that the National Association for Gifted Children gave above, and then we're going to work from that. So if you're under certain requirements at the state level or even at the local level, that's beyond this discussion. We're less concerned with a label for identifying gifted kids. We're really more concerned with getting kids to be referred for advanced academic services or get kids to be referred for gifted programming. Um, I think this idea of a label is it's something that is outside the scope of this conversation. What we're looking for is how can we get kids into our programming. Earlier, I mentioned that idea of kids who have the capability to perform at the highest levels or the potential to perform at the highest levels. If we're using local norms, it is very likely we're going to capture some kids who aren't typical of our program in the past. Those kids are going to come from different backgrounds. They're going to look a little different. There's going to be some differences in the level at which they come prepared for our program. And as a result, it means that we need to take a serious look at the support services and interventions that we provide those kids. It's not just a matter of bringing, like a good example, you've got a kid who we were able to identify because of a teacher rating scale. She is of a limited English language proficiency, but she came into to the classroom of a teacher, made great strides when compared to other kids of limited English language proficiency. She was way ahead of the curve. She clearly was someone who had potential for performing at the highest levels, and the teacher identified her as such. She comes into the program, but now the program is a heavily English language program, a lot of verbal communication. We're going to have to do some things to help that child succeed in that program because there's a bit of a mismatch uh, between we have where she is and where the program is, and we want to make sure that we're meeting the child where they are once they've been identified for the services. So the simpler of the two topics that I'm going to discuss is universal screening. With universal screening, we test everybody. We're looking for our top performers or those with potential to perform at the highest levels using by assessing every kid in the school. and we're going to then take some group of kids that we think our advanced academic services would serve their needs. And that whatever that range is that we're going to take for services is something that will be determined locally in the case of this example. So the local population can be either all students for a district, or, but more likely, it's all students for at a school. But regardless, it's always going to be at a given grade level. So we'll do all kindergartens. The reason we would not do all kids in a district is that we've got different population demographics at different schools. So, you know, it typical would be to use the local population at a single school when you're developing your universal screening process. We need a spreadsheet that'll help us do this. So you've got a lot of different raw scores coming in. You've got a 42 on a teacher rating scale, and you've got uh, a 69 on a achievement measure. Those are raw scores. I need to find out, well, what scores represent the 99th percentile, the 95th percentile, that sort of thing. And for this, we're going to use a spreadsheet. Let me show you, before I move over to that spreadsheet, let me show you the white paper that we've developed that explains all of this. I'm a bit better of a writer than I am a speaker, so I decided that I would prepare this white paper, and this is also available as a downloadable PDF, and I'll put the link to this in the show notes for the webinar recording. But this will allow you to take you step by step through the process. So in this universal screening section, we're going to talk about the steps that you go through, the Excel spreadsheet function that you're going to use to get the percentile ranks. Okay, so everything that I'm going to talk about is here in this document, and I'll be referring back to this document a bit later in the presentation. But let me shift over to this live Excel spreadsheet. So here's our percent rank spreadsheet for universal screening. What we've got is a group of approximately 160 students, and we've got raw scores. In this case, we use the raw scores from a teacher rating scale, but it could have been any performance measure, but we do need the raw scores in this column. Then we use a formula, the percentrank.inc, to establish the percent rank among the students. Let me go through here. I'm going to sort these so you can see that they have been sorted properly. I've got approximately 160 kindergartners I that I assessed, and I'm going to say sort by percent rank, largest to smallest. And here we go. So let's say if our program would take the top 10% of students, then we get a clear percent rank in this top group of kids. Let me make a quick note about how we set up this formula. So initially what we do is we're going to enter the formula here in this cell, and then I'm going to fill down so that I fill in all of the formulas for the rest of the spreadsheet when I'm setting this up. Fill down is pretty smart, but what it would normally do, what this formula says, is start with B4 here and go all the way to the bottom, B71, and that's gonna we're gonna work with that array of data, right? And then take this one raw score and tell me what percent rank it falls upon that array. And then after the column, then I would say, and do that to two significant digits. Okay. Uh, the reason the dollar signs are in there is I don't want, when we fill down, I don't want Excel to make the mistake of adjusting down every time it does a fill. I need the array to stay the same. I just need it to change when it fills down. I need it to change the raw score. So look here, 3 down. Now we've got B6 here, but the array stays the same. That's what the dollar signs are there for. Finally, percent rank does not report. It reports from 0 to 1. So then all we have to do is set this column to be formatted as a percentage, and then I get the percent. So if you have any questions about this, please refer to the white paper. I think it does a very nice job of explaining the different tools and the different functions within the spreadsheets that we're outlining. So one of the things that happens next is we're going to talk about doing local norms, all right? And I need to first establish what is a normal distribution, because one of the wonderful things about a normal distribution is that we can apply certain statistical tools to it. And that gives us a great deal of power about student reporting and about the information we're gathering from students if we're working with a normal distribution. So I've asked Dr. Leila Sanguris to take a moment and explain what a normal distribution is, how they work, and how the statistics that surround the normal distribution work. Leila, if you wouldn't mind explaining all that.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And okay, so I just want to review, maybe it's been a while since you've thought about statistics a little bit, but I have the normal distribution here on my screen. And so the normal distribution is just a probability that a score will fall within the bell curve. You can see where I have the arrow that's at the mean, and that's where you would find the data near that middle point or near the mean is the most frequent. We just see scores typically fall within this bell curve. And that's what you want to do, especially if you're thinking about coming up with or using a representative sample rather than an entire population, an entire school or district to establish your local norms. Standard deviation is another concept that will come up in the spreadsheet that Joel is going to be talking about. And we know that standard deviation refers to the spread outness of the scores. We are, when we're talking about identifying students who have a need for advanced academic services, we're really focusing on this, the right tail of the curve. So another important concept to understand are z-scores. And z-scores are, they measure how many standard deviations above and below the mean a data point falls. And so that looks very similar to a standard deviation. And what it does is it allows you to compare different scales. So you may have on one instrument, you have a range from 0 to 50. On another, you have 0 to 100. Z-scores allow you to, it standardizes the scores so that you can compare them and make an educated decision about what those scores mean and compare kids and all of those sorts of things. And then to bring it all together, I just wanted to talk about IQ scores, which are essentially z-scores that are multiplied by 15 and then add 100. So if you have a z-score of 0 on an IQ instrument, that's how you end up with, you multiply the 0 times 15 and then you add a 100. And again, this is right in the middle of our bell curve here. And then you can see the mean would be 0 standard deviations away from the mean, that 100. And then percentiles are also things that we talk about when we are looking at ranking students and identifying who might belong in the program or who has demonstrated a need. So again, we're looking at the typically 98th, 99th percentile, so 2 and 3 standard deviations above the mean.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now that Leila's explained what the normal distribution is, let me establish kind of how we're going to use it, and then I'll show you the step-by-step process that we're going to get when we do local norms. So local norms allow us to compare performance across performance measures by standardizing our raw scores. Remember what Leila was talking about with the standardization of the scores. We can compare an achievement measure, an aptitude measure, a teacher rating scale, a student product portfolio. Once we have standardized the scores, we have comparables. We have apples to apples comparison. We can see how a child's doing across multiple measures. We can use these standard scores as part of a two-stage identification process, but we need to do so with care. I'm going to explain this in just a minute, but the most common approach we have to referring kids to advanced academic services is this two-stage model. And the two-stage model introduces some challenges that we want to talk about in just a moment. So let me switch back over to my white paper, and I'll be able to talk a little bit more about this process. So let me move into the next stage of our conversation about the local norms. I'm going to introduce this idea of the two-stage identification process because it is the most commonly used method of referring students for gifted or advanced academic services. In this, so what we would do is we would have teachers refer kids for further assessment in terms of whether or not they qualify to receive the services that we're providing them. Uh, that process introduces the potential for inequity, because what you've done is you've introduced a gatekeeper, and the teacher is the gatekeeper in this case. And if that teacher isn't well trained in what potential top performance looks like in all different kind of special populations at the school, that can introduce the potential for some kids who should have been referred for advanced academic services not getting the referral for further assessment. So I think you just have to be super careful. I've listed an article in here that talks about this process and talks about some of the ways to manage the process. But it is a concern if you have a gatekeeper that you prevent some kids from being assessed. But this is sort of what's typical in gifted programs. So I'm going to use that as our process. So the first thing we do if we're going to use this process is we're going to try to get a representative sample of the local population. Remember what Layla was talking about. We need to get the mean and standard deviation of the local population. So I need a representative sample. I need something that looks like my local population. But because of money, I'm very unlikely to be able to test every child at each grade level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a representative sample. I can do this in other ways. Dr. Joe Renzulli talks about a way of taking every kid in, say, kindergarten, putting them on an alphabetical list and then randomizing that, and then taking every 5th or 10th student from that list, and that becomes your sample. Uh, Dr. Seguris also suggests beyond that, though, that we also look at things like if making sure that our special populations are represented in the sample, because the sample is going to be a little bit smaller. So it's possible you could leave out, you maybe have 5% Hispanics in the sample population, but in the actual local population, you've got 10%. So you just want to spot check that. Make sure that you've got enough representation from each of the subpopulations in your group. But once we've got that group selected, and once we've assessed that group of folks, then we're going to need a spreadsheet that allows us to determine the average, the average score, the mean score amongst the raw scores, and then also shows us the standard deviation. I'm going to show 2 formulas in the spreadsheet, or actually I want to show one because I actually tested the entire population in the case of the example that I gave. But we can use this stdev.p if we've tested the entire local population, or we can use this stdev.s if we've just got a sample of the local population. The formulas are slightly different on the back end. But let me switch over to that Excel spreadsheet. Okay, here's the spreadsheet that I've titled Standard Deviation and Mean. And you can see over on this side, I'm taking, in this case, I did every kindergarten. So I've got a kindergartner, so I've got 165 approximately scores over here. And I'm going to use 2 formulas to determine the mean and standard deviation of this sample population. I've got the average function. I'm going to use that establishes the mean of the population. And then I'm going to use the standard dev.p function. Now that's because I did everybody in the population. I'd use standard dev s if I did a sample, but I chose to do it this way in this case. That gives us 2 pretty magical numbers. We've got, and it reflects back to Layla's presentation. We now know the mean of this normal curve, and we know the standard deviation of this curve. So once I know the mean and standard deviation, I have a lot of power in terms of my ability to take a group of referred students and assess just that group of kids for qualification for gifted ed or advanced academic services. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to use this function, the standardized function in the spreadsheet, and I'm going to use this norm.s distribution function in the spreadsheet. So let me take you over to the live spreadsheet, and I'll show you how that works in a live spreadsheet. Okay, so here we are on the spreadsheet that I've titled Standard Scores and Percentile Rank. And you see the two numbers that I pulled from the previous spreadsheet. I've got the mean and I've got a standard deviation. I need those two to do the calculations that I'm about to do. I've got a group of, in this case, approximately 30 kids that have been referred for further testing for our advanced academic services or gifted programming. And I'm going to take, in this case, the example is going to be a teacher rating scale. I'm going to take the scores from and put the raw scores here in this column right here. And then I'm going to use a function called the standardize function. And that function is going to convert that raw score using this mean and standard deviation into a standard score. Okay, and then I'm going to use a second function that will convert that standard score into a percentile. Okay, so at this point, if you look at a kid with a raw score of 12, for example, on a normal distribution, that's going to be a 22% as a percentile rank. If I look at raw score of a 28, that turns out to be a 98% on this spreadsheet. So you can see it's a super easy way uh, to look at a group of kids. If I wanted to sort this, I can come across here, use the sort function, and I'm going to sort on that percentile. But of course you could have sorted on uh, the standardized score as well and get the same results. And I'm going to go from largest to smallest. Sorry, that one didn't work. There we go. And there, if I'm going to take the top 10% of the kids, I see I've got 3 kids from this group that qualifies for the programming. And again, if my oral instructions here live are less than helpful, I apologize. I do think the white paper does a really nice job of walking you through each of the steps, and we also link to all the spreadsheets, so you'll be able to just put in the raw scores and be able to develop local norms or universal screening at your school district. We've got several questions from from you guys, and I'd like to be able to address a few of those as we go. So I'm looking at the Q&A box now and looking at some of the questions. So let me bring Layla in, and we'll answer some of the questions that you guys have proposed. Thanks for using the Q&A box, everybody, and I've got some good interaction here. So the first question is, I know this is super useful, but because of the coronavirus right now, a lot of schools have closed. We're not sure what to do. And in terms of achievement measures and aptitude measures, hopefully that testing was done earlier in the year. I can't speak to that. I can't speak to the idea of teacher rating scales. And I know the teachers right now are incredibly overwhelmed with trying to do online courseware and that sort of thing. Uh, so this may be something we put off till the summer. It depends on the feeling of your teachers and your timing, but you could certainly do a teacher rating scale at this time. Those teachers have been in the classroom long enough with the kids that they've got a sense of their ability and their how they're performing in the classroom. So it'd be absolutely legitimate to use teacher rating scales. We have online scales available, so you'd be easy to do that as long as the teachers have the time. Uh, Next question. We're not able to test all of a population with every instrument, but we do have achievement tests for everyone. Can we mix national norms with local norms? Layla, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so we've talked about local norms and how they can be useful if you feel like you are maybe not identifying enough kids, you want to identify more kids, or you may think that you have an equity issue, something like that. And so if you think about the reason that you're using local norms, it's probably a good one because it's a lot easier to just rely on the national norms that are already published. And so you just need to really think about you certainly can combine them because again it typically means that the scores will be if you're creating a spreadsheet of all of your data, you probably are calculating z-scores for all of the different instruments so that you can compare across the different scales, which is totally fine. But again, it comes back to the reason why you want to use local norms, and are you achieving the goal that you hope to achieve by using national norms as well. So without knowing the exact context, I would say if you're going to use local norms on one assessment, it would make sense that you would use them on all of the different assessments. But you may have a reason why you want to mix the two.
Uh, let me Let me look here. We've got, oh, I've got a good question here, Layla, that I'm going to also have you address if you wouldn't mind. Can we have different cutoff scores for different populations in order to increase diversity? So, for example, Hispanics might get a different range of qualification scores for referred services than another group might. Uh, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, um, and I understand the reason behind it, in that maybe you do have a concern that maybe you're not identifying enough of certain groups, and that's a big issue, and it's one that we all care quite a bit about. Um, However, legally, you cannot either admit someone into a program or not admit them into a program based on their membership in certain groups. So, ethnicity, gender, those kinds of things. So, those are protected groups, and so you can't say that we're going to split them out. We're going to stratify our population, and then we're going to pick the top 8% from each group, because legally you can't do that. The other issue that I think that we're getting at here is that we want to make sure that we're identifying students from all of these different groups, and we maybe have a fear that the data that we're using is not allowing us to identify those kids. And so, a second question that I would want to ask is, maybe have you thought about looking differently at the ways that you're identifying your kids? And is there a way that you could maybe add in additional data or reconsider the data that you're collecting to make sure that you're getting at what you want to get at? So maybe conducting interviews with students, and just kind of rethinking, using those behavior rating scales that Joel mentioned, kind of bulking up your identification tools so that you can really identify the kids who need the services. And that's the other thing, is that you again, while absolutely we want to make sure that we are equitably identifying students across groups, we want to make sure that the data that we're gathering is accurate and really representing the need that they have. But you want to capture that for the entire campus or district. So yeah, so no, you can't do that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. And that you mentioned the teacher rating scales, and that's one of the next questions is, can you provide examples of teacher rating scales? And so at Proofrock Press, we have two nationally normed instruments, and I know that we're talking about local norms here, but we do have two nationally normed instruments. That does not mean you couldn't take the raw data that comes in from those nationally normed instruments and convert them to local norms, which many districts do. But the first one is the SIGs, and the second one is the UTAG. So the SIGs is the screener for identifying gifted students, and that is one that Layla and her team are currently doing the renorming of, and we should have new national norms. Layla, we're expecting when?
Next spring, right? Spring 2021.
Yeah, spring 2021. And that's, we're excited about that because that'll give us some brand new updated norms I know that that's a lot of work on Layla's part. The UTAGs is the Universal Talented and Gifted Screener, and that is also nationally normed as well. So those are two options. And then also we have the Scripsis, or the Renzulli scales we call it, and then we also have the Hope scale. And those you do need to do local norms with if you want to, or you can use a ranking report either way. But we have a separate webinar that we posted up on our website. So if you go to the webinar archive, you can see a webinar on the teacher rating scales and Layla and I talk in depthly about both of those. Well, that's about all the questions. Layla, I want to thank you so much for coming, and I know that you had been gracious enough to offer that if folks need some consulting services where local norms are concerned, that you'd be happy to collaborate with the district as time permits. So I'm gonna splash up your information at the end of this presentation so folks will have that. But before I do that, let me just thank you so much for coming. I sure appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for the time that you guys have committed to this webinar. Thanks everybody.
Yes, thank you so much.